Hello, my friends. This is Dr. M, supporting your journey with principles of economics. Now we are moving towards the end of the course, and we are ready to summarize and put together what we have covered already and introduce some new items. Today we'll talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Essentially, we have to start with the declaration of review that we have done in the past, and that was related to the production function. So what you have in front of you, two graphs that we covered before. On the bottom you have labor. As labor is increasing, people produce more output or gross domestic product. That is noted on the left hand side on the Q, and on the top graph you see also relationship with this labor and the real wage rate. So it's a labor market that is related to unemployment. So on the top graph is basically describes what happens to employment versus unemployment, and on the bottom what happens to the output when it comes to changing technology, population, taste and preferences. So now we are ready to put together and think about long run versus short run, because it is imperative to consider and distinguish those two. In the short run, decisions are going to be very different when it comes to human choices versus in the long run. And that's why it's so imperative and critical to put long run and short run together under consideration. So what we have here is long run aggregate supply, which has a straight line with nearly zero slope, or I should say an infinite slope, because it's a straight line, and in the long run quantity does not change. And it intersecting what is called aggregate demand, which we have already considered as money supply divided by cash balance ratio. So you can see the equilibrium that is determining the output, gross domestic product, that is pointed out with a star, and the price level. And that's the equilibrium that you'll find under intersection of aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. Essentially, long run aggregate supply curve for the entire economy is the output, describing the output produced in the economy. And as you see by the slope, it does not depend upon the price level. That is why when you add zeros to the currency, or you subtract zeros, called devaluation of the currency, that happened in many different countries, does not impact long run aggregate supply. Now, aggregate demand, as you see, it's a rectangle hyperbola, and basically price on the star and Q on the star is a long run equilibrium, price level and output level accordingly. Now, the output in the long run, gross domestic product, is determined by tastes, preferences, technology, and population. Those are the factors that drive the output in the long run. And the price level depends upon the money supply and money demanded, which we have already covered previously. And now what is left to do is consider comparative static. What happens when the variables change? Comparative static in this fashion indicates the following. When money supply is increased, which means that central bank is printing more money, or the Federal Reserve printing more money, or it could also mean that the foreign countries no more willing to hold US dollars in their reserves and no more demand US dollars. When foreigners decide to no longer be interested in US dollars, they try to get rid of them. And thus excess of US dollars comes back to United States charging goods and services, and that could trigger a money supply increase in the United States. So it's not just what we're experiencing in the United States that is driven by the central bank. It also is driven by nowadays what foreign governments do. And as you may know, the central banks and the governments around the world, they keep some cash reserves in a particular currencies. And US dollar has been one of the dominant currencies where those reserves were kept. So the central bank or the Federal Reserve in the United States has to be very careful, just like any central bank, to keep track of money supply, because when you have too much money that is flooding your economy domestically within a country, then you have too much money chasing relatively less goods and services, and that will trigger inflation. So you see the demand, aggregate demand shifts upward. The long run GDP does not change, but you do trigger the inflation, since there is relatively more money chasing relatively fewer goods and services. The price level increases. That is going to trigger increase in spending on goods and services, because people want to get rid of excess money, and it will also increase the spending on investment goods and services. So people start buying bonds with excess money, and that will certainly create, based on the first law of demand, rise in prices and nominal interest rates. I will talk more about nominal interest rates. We have covered financial economics in the previous presentations. So the price between today and tomorrow will rise when interest rates go up, because interest rates represent the price of intertemporal choice, or price for economic trade-off between today and tomorrow. So that will in turn make present value, or the assets denominated in present terms of any investment projects, to go down, given that the interest rates goes up based on the present value formulas that we have introduced in previous video presentation. All right, so we have done comparative static as it relates to money supply change. Let me quickly review nominal interest rate calculation. Although we have done this before, I think it would be helpful if we can review this again, so you can track my conclusions with more comprehension. So we have discussed in the previous financial economics presentation that nominal interest rates, that as we discovered, depends upon the real interest rate R plus expected inflation pi sub e plus default risk. So think about what happens to the present value of the project that is going to last for a very long time, including in perpetuity. Because your interest rates, and I'm going to shift here just to be helpful to my notepad, because we have discovered previously that present value of a future denominated asset is 1 plus interest rate, and interest rate in turn depends upon real interest rate, expected inflation, and default risk. So when this interest rate goes up, the present value must go down. And that's what I was indicating to you with comparative static analysis from the previous slide. It's very simple but extremely powerful algebra that you want to understand if you ever going to encounter investment decisions. And I'm sure that it's just a matter of time. You will. It's just a matter of time when it happens. So the next item is to see what happens to decrease in money. Let's say the Federal Reserve or central bank is essentially takes some cash out of the circulation and burns that, because they have to control how much money is chasing goods and services, and it, to some extent depends upon the GDP. Now, with coronavirus, COVID-19, in 2020, what we have experienced increased demand for US dollars, especially in less developed countries. And that created a strain for US economy because more people around the world wanted to hold their reserves, or should I say, shift their savings to be denominated in US dollars. And thus the value of US dollar pushed up. Now, that is certainly can impact the money supply in the United States. And in fact, it may go down. And that's why it created a challenge for Americans to cope with those changes. Let's see what happens when the money supply decreases. And in this case, you observe that GDP in the long run does not change, but you are essentially shifting aggregate demand down from the solid line to this dotted line, and your price level decreases. Now, since decreasing in money supply, or that may have resulted from the demand of US dollars all over the world due to this pandemic in 2020, it means that less dollars chasing relatively more stuff, such as goods and services, cars, houses, and such. That will lead to reduction in spending. Consumption goes down, investment spending decreases, and that would put pressure on bond prices based on the first law of demand, and on stock prices as well. So it put downward pressure, and that's exactly what you have seen that was taking place in investment capacity. Now, you also will observe that the nominal interest rate will go down, and once the nominal interest rate impacts in a downward trend, it will push the present value of future dominated project to go up. So, and you are observing deflation in this case. Now, let me look into cash balance ratio and how that's going to impact our decisions and behavioral choices as we see that. K is a cash balance ratio, and it's located in denominator. So when K goes up, there is increase in demand for money, which historically does not happen very much with K. In the long run, K is around the same, close to zero. But if people decide to hold more money, let's say they have been spooked by a pandemic, or some expectations of the war, or whatever the reason is, if they decide to hold more money, that would increase the cash balance ratio relative to other stuff. That means that consumption will decrease, investment will decrease, your aggregate demand will shift downward, and it will initiate deflation, which means that the prices will go down. And finally, we can look into reduction in the demand for money. When cash balance ratio goes down, your aggregate demand shifts upward, you are triggering inflation. That means that people want to hold less money relative to other stuff charging goods and services, and thus they want to spend more. Consumption will increase and investment will increase. That will impact the interest rates, and it will impact the bond market as well as the associated prices. And on that note, I would like to finish this presentation and wish you a blessed and healthy day. Thank you.